to this video lesson. Today we're going to talk about intersectionality. These words may sound difficult at first, but the idea behind it is actually very simple. Intersectionality helps us understand why people's lives are not all the same. It helps us understand why some people face more barriers than others, even when they belong to the same group. In this lesson, we will not focus on definition ones. We will focus on real lives and real experience. My goal today is not that you memorize concept. My goal is that at the end of this lesson, you can say, I understand why inequality is more complex than I thought. Before we start, let me explain what we will learn today. First, we will understand what intersectionality means and why this concept is important for understanding today's society. Second, we will explore why inequality is complex and why it cannot be expressed using only one category, such as gender or class. Third, we will identify rare barriers that appear when different forms of inequality overlap. And finally, we will reflect on how intersectionality shapes people's life experience, both at individual and social level. You may ask why it's important to keep talking about inequality. It's important because inequality remains a definitive feature of contemporary life, shaping access to opportunities, resources, and well-being. Despite progress in some areas like education, employment, health, and social participation, the opportunities are not equal distributed. When you're born, your family background and your visible aspect is of your identity can profoundly influence your life trajectory. Some groups consistently face more barriers than others, and that obstacles are often structural rather not individual. Understanding inequality is the first step through creating more equal societies when everyone can have a fair chance to thrive. We may understand inequality beyond individual efforts. First of them, not just personal choices. Which is individual efforts matter, inequality cannot be explained solely through personal responsibilities. Structural factors create an even playing field before individuals even begin. The social structure shapes the outcomes, so institutions, policies, and social norms create system advantage for some groups within disadvantage others. This structure operates individually of individuals' merits or efforts. The context is everything. The circumstances into which you born, like your family resources, your neighbor, your quality of local schools, profoundly shape what opportunities become available for you. Gender as the starting point. Gender is often the first dimension we talk about when we talk about inequality. For a long time, societies have recognized that being a woman or being a man can strongly influence a person's life. This influence starts very early and continues through our lives. When we talk about gender, we are not only talking about biological differences, we are talking about social experience. Society has ideas about what women and men should do, how they should behave, and what roles are considered normal or acceptable for them. From childhood, our gender shapes how people are perceived. For example, boys and girls are often engaged to develop different qualities. Some behaviors are praised while others are discouraged depend on gender. Over time, this message influences in confidence, self-image, and aspirations. People might learn what they are supposed to want and what to avoid even without being aware of it. Gender also influences access to resources. In many societies, gender affects access to education, to economic resources, and to positions of power. This does not mean that all women have the same experience, but it does mean that gender plays an important role in shaping opportunities. For example, gender can influence how in encouraging to continue studying, who is expected to take care of others, and who is considered suitable for learning roles. Gender inequality does not appear in only one area of life. It exists across many domestic domains, such as education, health, politicians, family life, and social participation. This is why gender is often used as a strain point when analyzing inequality. However, in this, and this is a key point on this slide, gender also is not enough to explain people's experience. If we focus only on gender, we might miss other important facts such as age, disability, social class, place or residence, or migrant background. Gender it's as important dimension of equality, but it's not the only one. To fully understand how inequality works, we need to look beyond gender and consider how it interacts with other social factors. It's important to understand that not all women face the same challenges. When we talk about gender inequality, we sometimes speak of it all women have similar experience. In reality, this is not true. For example, a woman with economic results living in a large city may face very different barriers than a woman with few resources living in a rural area. In the same way, a disability woman experiences inequality differently from a woman without disability. Age also matters. A young woman may face different expectations and pressures than an old woman, and this difference shows us that women's experience of inequality vary weirdly. Gender interacts with other factors such as social class, race, ethnic, disability, age, and place of residence. This interaction creates different patterns of advantage and disadvantage. Some women face multiple barriers at the same time, while others may face fewer. This is why on one-size-fits-all approach does not work. Policies and/or action designed for all women may help some women, but they can miss the specific needs of others. Understanding these differences is essential if we want to address inequality in the fair and effective way. Now let's talk about why simple explanations are often not enough. When we try to explain inequality using one simple factor, such as gender, class, race, or usually miss part of the reality. And this explanation may seem clear and easy to understand, but they are often too simple. They do not capture the full complexity of people's lives. The problem with simplicity is that it ignores how different forms of inequality interact. For example, gender does not exist separately for class or race. This factor works through and influence each other. When we look at only one factor, we lose importance of details. We miss nonsense and we overlook real experience. Reality is multidimensional. This means that people's lives are shaped by more dimensions at the same time. These dimensions include identity, social position, and context. They do not exist in isolation. They combine, overlap, and reinforce each other. This combination creates unique experience that cannot be explained by one simple cause. To really understand inequality, we need to move beyond binary thinking. Um, Binary thinking means thinking in simple categories, like either this or that. But real life is rarely so simple. Critical thinking helps us recognize the complexity webs of factors that shape people's lives. When we move from simple factor explanation to interactional factor, our understanding becomes deeper and more accurate. We need to go from simple category thinking to complexity. Traditionally, inequality has often been analyzed using one category at a time. For example, gender inequality is studied separately from class inequality or race inequality in analysis or its own. And this tradition approach treats each category as it is, were independent from the other. At first, this may seem logical or unorganized. However, it's create important problems. One of the main problems is the hidden difference appears inside groups. When we focus only on one category, we assume that people within that group are similar. But in reality, there are many different within the group. These differences are shaped the other factors, such as social class, age, disability, or place of residence. Simple category thinking hides this variety and makes some experience invisible. This is why a new framework is needed. We need an approach that can reorganize overlapping identities and compound disadvantage. This means understanding that people can face more than one for an equality at the same time, and that this inequality interact. The recognition of this complexity is what paved the way to intersectionality. Intersectionality was developed specific to analyze how different systems of inequality overlap and reinforce each other. It allows us to move from simplicity explanation to more realistic and complete understanding of social inequality. Now that we have seen the limits of simple explanation, we can introduce a new framework, intersectionality. Intersectionality is an analytical framework. This means it is a way of thinking and analyzing reality. It helps us understand how different aspects of identity combine and shape people's experience. This aspect can include gender, race, social class, disability, age, sexual orientation, and others. Instead of treating each from inequality separately, intersectionality looks at how they work together. For example, is that not ask only, is this gender inequality? Is this class inequality? It asks, how do gender, class, and other factors interact in this situation? This is a very important change in perspective. Intersectionality forces an interaction, not an isolation. It recognizes that identities do not exist alone. They interact and influence each other at the same time. Because of this, people can experience both discrimination and privilege despite of how their identities combine. Finally, intersectionality helps us see social realities more clearly. It reveals patterns of inequality that often remain invisible when we use simple categories approaches. But using this framework, we can better understand why people's experiences are so different even when they seem to belong to the same group. Now let's look at where the concept of intersectionality came from. The term intersectionality was introduced by Kimberly Crewell in 1989. She is a legal scholar who works in the field of critical race theory and feminist legal studies. Her work focuses on understanding how discrimination operates in real life, especially in legal systems. She developed the concept because she observed a serious problem. Anti-discrimination laws treat race and gender as two separate categories. This means that person could claim discrimination based on race or discrimination based on gender. But for black women, discrimination did not work at this way. Black women often experience discrimination that involves both race and gender at the same time. However, because the law looked at this category separately, their experience were often not recognized. In other words, their case did not fit nearly into exactly legal categories. As a result, black women's experience and discrimination were often ignored or excluded from legal protection. Intersectionality was created to explain this gap. It was the way to say some people experience discrimination at the intersection on different social categories, and this experience is not simple the of each part. It is also important to say that this author did not explain from zero. He works on decades of black feminist thoughts. Many black feminist schools have already hidden how different forms of oppression are connected and interlocked. Uh, she gives a name to this idea and helps bring it into academic and legal debate. These slides show the core idea of intersectionality. The main idea of that each person has multiple identities at the same time. We are never only one thing. For example, a person is not only a woman or only young or only from certain place. All these identity exists simultaneously. The second key idea is that identities impact. This means that our identities do not work separately. They influence each other. Gender interact with age interact with social class interact with place of residence. Because of this interaction, people experience can be very different, even if this shape one identity. Another important idea is that context shapes meaning. The same identity can have different meaning depending on the situation. For example, an identity that is not problem in one context can become a barrier in another context. As a result of these identities, inequality emerge. In intersectionality helps us understand how patterns of advantage or disadvantage creates. Some people benefit from these systems when others face barriers. And these outcomes are not random. They are produced by the interaction of identities on and the system of power. So, understanding intersectionality means recognize two things. First, identity is multifaceted, not simple. And second, inequality is structural, not accidental. Now, let's focus on the relationship between intersectionality and power. One of the most important ideas of intersectionality is the inequality in structural. This means that inequality is not only about individual attitudes or personal mm, prejudice. Of course, personal attention matters, but intersectionality shows us that inequality is mainly built into system. This system includes laws, public politics, institution roles, and cultural norms. All of this shapes people's life in different ways. Some systems are designed in ways that benefit certain groups, while others are disadvantaged by the same system. This happens even when no one has bad intention. Other operating thought is social categories. Categories like gender, class, race, age of disability influence. Who has access to resources, whose voice is heard, whose needs are considered important. Some groups hold an structural privilege. That means that the system works more easily for them. Other groups face system exclusion, not because of who they are and individuals, but because of how systems are organized. Intersectionality helps us go beyond identity's experience. It does not only ask, what happens to this person? It also asks, what partners of powers and inequality exist in society? By focusing on these patterns, intersectionality helps us understand why inequality is repeated against and against, across different contexts and generations. This slide shows us an important idea. Gender never works alone. So, to understanding gender inequality, we cannot look only at the gender it by itself. We need to look to how gender interact with other factors. This interaction create different experience, even amongst people who share the same gender. Let's look some of these factors. One of them is age. Age matter because people are at different life stages. A young woman and an old woman may face very different experience, opportunities, and constraints. Age shape what is considered appropriate or possible in certain moments in life. Another factor is place of residence. Life in an urban area or in a rural area make a big difference. For example, to access to services, education, transport, or social networking. So gender inequality can look different depending on where the people lives. Disability is another important dimension. Disability can affect participation on many areas of life. Physical, sensorial, cognitive, or mental health condition can create additional barriers. We also have social class. Social class is related to economic and resources, education, and social position. It influences opportunities, security, and life choices. Gender inequality is often experienced differently depend of social class. Finally, there is migration barriers. Migration status, country of origin, language, or cultural background can all affect how people are treated or the opportunity they have. So the key message of this explanation is gender inequality cannot be fully understood at its own. It must be analyzed together with other social factors. Now let's talk about why intersectionality is so important. Intersectionality matters because it helps us see things that are usually hidden. When we analyze inequality using only one factor, many experiences remain invisible. Intersectionality allows us to uncover and cooperate disabilities. This means understanding that some people face more than one barrier at the same time. Another important reason is that intersectionality challenges simplistic narratives. Often, social problems are explained using very simple stories. For example, one simple cause or one simple solution. Intersectionality questions these one-size-fits-all examples. It remains that reality is more complex. By recognizing complexity, we gain a more realistic understanding of how inequalities works. Finally, intersectionality improves social analysis. When we understand inequality better, we can design better resolution. This includes better research, better politics, and more effective interventions. Inequality helps us focus on real experience, specifically those of groups that are often marginalized or ignored. Now that we understand what intersectionality is, we can talk about intersectional barriers. Intersectional barriers are obstacles that people face when different forms of inequality overlap. These barriers do not come from one simple factor, like gender or class. They appear when several disadvantages exist at the same time. Because of this, intersectional barriers can often may often be more complex and harder to understand. First, intersectional barriers are created by overlapping inequalities. This means that they exist in the intersection of different systems of disadvantages. For example, a barrier may appear only because of gender, but because gender interacts with age, disability, place or resident, or social class. It results in a unique obstacle that cannot be explained by looking one fact alone. Second, Intersectional barriers are structural, not individual. They are not mainly caused by one person's attitudes or intentions. Instead, they are building into policies, institutions, and social norms. This means that people can face these barriers even when no one is trying to discriminate them. Finally, intersectional barriers are often invisible because they do not fit nearly into a single category explanation. They are frequently not recognized. They may be ignored in politics, states, or in everyday basis. This invisibility makes them even harder to challenge. So, understanding intersectional barriers help us see why some obstacles persist and why they are not always easy to identify or remove. Now we are gonna look to a couple of examples of intersectional barriers. These slides show us a visual overview based on real data and real analytic. The goal is help us see how barriers appears when different areas of life overlap. In the diagram, we can see three main areas: education, employment, and healthcare. Each of their area can already contact barriers of each other, but the more important part of these images is when the areas overlap. When education and employment overlap, people may face barriers related to qualification, access to stable jobs, or opportunities for progress. When education and healthcare overlaps, barriers may appear in access to information, support, services, or early diagnostics. When employment and healthcare overlap, people may experience different difficulties related to health conditions, job securities, or access to care. At the center of the diagram, when all these three areas overlap, we see housing. This shows us that housing problems often appear when multiple disabilities combine. For example, difficulties in education, unstable employment, and a limited access to healthcare can all interact and affect access to safe and stable housing. The key message of this infogram is simple. Intersectional barriers do not exist in isolation, they emerge when disadvantages combine across different areas of life. This is why these barriers cannot be fully uncovered by looking at one or simple fact at a time. These slides help us bring everything together. It reminds us that barriers to equality or inclusion are rarely simple. Most people do not experience disabilities in just one way. Instead, they experience multiple and overlapping barriers at the same time. These barriers instead interact with each other and create complex situations. Intersectional barriers are shaped by different elements. They are influenced by social and cultural norms, structural and institutional systems, and individual circumstances. All of these elements combine to shape people's life experience. This means that inequality is not only about people's situation, it's also about how society is organized. These barriers often simultaneously across different dimensions of identity. For example, gender can interact with age, place of residence, abilities, or migrant status. When these dimensions overlap, barriers become stronger and more difficult to overcome. This is why some people face greater challenges, even when they support a system exists. Understanding how these barriers interact is essential. It helps us design more inclusive politics and progress. Politics that combine only one dimension often fail to reach the person who needed support the most. An intersectional perspective allows us to have a better understanding of the reality and respond in a more efficient way. Social norms and stereotypes create a strong experience about how people should behave and what they should do. These expectations are often invisible, but they are very powerful. Gender stereotypes aside rigid roles to people based on perspective identities. They can limit opportunities and also limit self expression. People may feel that certain choices are not for them, even if they would like to pursue them. These norms are reinforced by family, communities, the media, and the institution. Because of this, the pressure to conform can be very strong, especially for people who do not fit traditional norms. The result is often a reduced autonomy, consistent core, and believe they are not living the life they want. Now let's focus on education and opportunities. Access to quality education is not equal for everyone. Some groups face it more barriers from the beginning, such as girls or certain richer person, child with disability, or people from low-income families. These barriers affect enrolled, staying at home at school, and completing education. Where people live also matters. Geographics and social difference strongly influence education opportunities. Rural or remote areas often lack infrastructures and trained teachers or learning resources. Poverty, discrimination, or social exclusion make access even more difficult. Education inequality has long-term consequences. When people do not have basic skills or qualifications, their future opportunities are limited. This can lead to fewer opportunities, lower incomes, and reduced social mobility. As a result, inequality is often passed from age and generations. Focus on place and territory. Geography matters because where people live strongly affect their access to services or opportunities. Urban and rural areas often have very different conditions. Urban areas usually have better access to healthcare, education, employment, and social services. Instead, rural and remote areas often face important gaps in the services. These differences are not just inconvenient, they shape change. Mobility is often limited by geography, economic resources, and social factors. People lived in marginate territories may lack transport, face difficult when access to elsewhere, and be unable to move due to financial and cultural resources. Because of this, places become bound in identity and barriers. This where someone lives can strongly influence in the opportunities they have and the barriers they face it. Young women face multiple barriers. One of these barriers is age-related discrimination. Young people are often seen as inexperienced or naive. Because of this, these opportunities are something and then valued in decision-making spaces. Other barrier is gender experience. Young women often face pressure to conform to traditional roles. These roles are related to marriage, caregiving, or appearance. This pressure can limit their education choices or career ambitions. This is also the issue of limited autonomy. Control over important life decisions such as education, work, relationship, or mobility is often restricted. Family and community norms can strongly influence their decision. The key idea here is intersecting disadvantages. Young women often experience age and gender discrimination at the same time. These barriers overlap and limit their voice, their agency, and their opportunities. People with disabilities often face systematic barriers that limit participation in many areas of life. Physical spaces, communication situations, or institutional practices are frequently designed without considering the diverse needs. This creates exclusion by design. Accessibility it's not only about ramps or limbs, it's also including access to information, services, employment, and social interaction. When these are not accessible, people with disability face greater isolation and fewer opportunities. This barrier can lead to poverty or marginalization. Discrimination and negative attitudes make the situation even worse. As a result, opportunities are reduced and dignity is often affected. If we focus on migration and social position, one of the important barriers is language. Migrants may have difficult accessing services, education, or employment if they don't speak the local language fluently. This can limit integration and economic participation. Another barrier is legal and administration obstacles. Immigrants' systems are often complex and difficult to navigate. Security documents and accessing rights can be strongful and intimidated. Legal status often may affect many aspects of daily lives. Migrants can also learn to social isolation. Being separated from family, community, and family culture context can create a strong sense of isolation. Discrimination and xenophobic can make this situation even worse. Together, these factors shape migrants' social position and create intersectional barriers that affect participation, well-being, and opportunities. Knowing all of this, you may ask why intersectional barriers persist. Even where are solutions of inequality, many barriers remain in place. This happens for several important reasons. The first reason is deeply rooted social norms. Beliefs of gender, ability, race, and other identities are very old. They are part of culture and they passing down from one generation to the other. Because of these beliefs feel normal or natural, they are difficult to question. Even when laws change, social attitudes may change more slowly. The second reason is institutional insti- Institutional are usually designed to maintain, stabilize, and the status quo. Policies, rules, and power structures do not change easily. Challenging them requires time, resources, and a strong political will. As a result, systems often continue to work this way that disadvantages certain groups, even when inequalities are recognized. The third reason is that lack of inclusive perspective. Decision-making spaces often do not include people who experience intersectional disadvantage. When marginal voices are missing, politics and creators without fully understanding real needs. This means that solution may address only one part of the problem or miss it completely. All these factors together explain why intersectional barriers persist. They are not accident, they are rooted in culture, institution, and power structures. Understanding this helps us see the reduction in inequality requires more than small changes. It requires a long-term commitment, including perspective and structural transformation. These slides help us answer an important question. Who is most affected by intersectional inequality? Intersectional inequality does not matter everyone at the same way. Some people face more barriers because they are positioned at multiple intersectional of margination identities. This means that different forms of disadvantage overlaps in their lives. First, we have people at multiple intersections. These are individuals whose identities spur several marginal categories. For example, woman with disability or young migrant woman living in a rural area. These people do not face just one barrier. They face composite barriers that interact and reinforce each other. Second, some people who are from dominant norms. Societies had certain ideas about what is conveniently normal. People whose identities or life experience differ than most from their norms often face stronger stigmas and discrimination. The farther someone is from where is socially accepted, to more barriers that may intercom. Finally, many affected groups are underestimated and unheard. Marginal groups are often excluded from decision-making experiences. Their voice are not present in policy designs, institutions, or leadership roles. As a result, they need an experience a remain of invisibility, even when politics are created to address inequality. Now let's focus on the consequence of intersectional inequality. Intersectional inequality is not only about barriers, it also has a real and long-term effect in people's lives. These consequences affect opportunities, participation, and safety. The first consequence is reduced life opportunities. When people face multiple barriers like access to education, healthcare, employment, and social services, their life is become limited. This restriction restricted their position and affect their overlap well-being. Over time, these limitations reduce people's ability to improve their life conditions. The second consequence is limited participation. Intersectional inequality often excluded people from social, economic, and civil life. This means they may not be able to fully participate in their communities. They have fewer chances to contribute to the herd and to influence decisions that affect their life. As a result, exclusion becomes normative. The third consequence is increased vulnerability. People who are marginalized and often more excluded are more exposed to poverty, violence, exclusion, and crisis situations. Without adequate protection or support, these risks become stronger. This vulnerability is not accidental; it's the product by systems that fail to include the protect everyone's equality. The key message on this slide is clear. Intersectional inequality does not only create disadvantages, it limits lives, reduces participation, and increases vulnerability. Understanding these consequences help us when to see why address intersectional inequality is not optional, but is essential for social judgment, justice, and inclusion. Now, let's look the risk of ignoring intersectionality. When intersectionality is not taken into account, well-intentioned actions can end up doing more harm than good. This happens because barriers do not exist in isolation. If we fail to understand how they interact, we fail to reach those who face great disadvantages. The first risk is reinforcing exclusion. When programs are designed without an intersectional lens, they often benefit those who are already better positioned within a marginal group. As a result, existing gaps become wider even inside communities that are supposed to be supported. Instead of reducing inequality, intervention can unintentionally provoke it. The second risk is producing ineffective policies. Policies that ignore intersectional, often and superficial level problems rather than root causes. This may fail to reach the intended benefits or address only part of the issue. Without understanding people's real lived experience, progress, and lack of impact and sustainability. The third risk is silence marginated voice. When people at multiple intersections are not active involved, they need some perspective remain invisible. This exclusion from decision making reinforces the marginalization and limit meaning changes. Inclusive not only access, it is about being heard and validated. The key message is stop ignoring the intersectionality that it's creating a neutral outcome. It's creating unequal outcomes. To design fair efficacy and inclusive politics, intersectionality must be part of the analytics from the very beginning. Now let's mark a crucial transition from understanding to action. Awareness of intersectional inequality is an essential first step. However, awareness it's a song, it's not enough. Understanding must lead to concrete actions. Intersectional inequality is not accident or individual. It is produced and sustained by the structures, institutions, politics, laws, and social norms. Because of this, it cannot be addressed only through individual level solutions, such as changing attitude or increasing personal awareness. Structural problems require structural responses. Taking action means implementing changes. This included reform discrimination laws and politics, redistribute resources more equality, and transforming institution practice that include certain groups. It also means questioning power dynamics, who make decisions, whose voice is heard, and whose needs are considerably overlooked. The visual power of this slide hidden an important message. It is often a gap between analyzing and implementing. Uh, Bringing this gap requires commitment, long-term investigation, and political will. Good intentions are not enough if they are not backed by action. Effective action must also be participating. Solution works better when people are grounded in their life experience of those more affected by intersectional inequality. This means involving marginal groups not only as beneficiaries but as leaders, decision makers, and experts on these own realities. The key takeaway from this life is clear. Intersectional should not stop at theory or diagnosis. It should guide how we design politics, programs, and practices to be more inclusive in the practice. As we conclude this exploration of intersectional barriers, it is important to pause and reflect. Intersectional invite us not only to understand inequality, but to question the system we live within and we help to maintain. One key question is why benefits from current system? Some groups hold more power, access to resources more easily, and see their experience treated as the norm. These advantages are often invisible to those who benefit from them. Another critical question is who faces the greatest barrier? Those positions at multiple intersectional of disadvantages are often missing from decision-making spaces. Their voices are overheard, their need admit, and their potential constrained. These questions are not abstract or rhetorical. They request honest expectation and responsibility. Only by recognizing who benefits and who is excluded can we begin to build a system that are truly inclusive and inequality for everyone. Inequality is complex. It is not created by a simple factor, a simple decision, or a simple law. It is woven through institution, history, and everyday interaction in ways that are often invisible but deeply embedded. There is why simple explanation rarely capture how inequality actually works. When we rely on simple causes narratives, such as blaming individual courses or pointing to one discrimination policy, we fail to see how multiple systems of oppression operate simultaneously. Gender, class, disability, migration status, and other factors do not act separately. They interact, reinforce one another, and shape people's life changes in common ways. This complexity demands a more sophisticated form of analyzing. It requires us to hold multiple truths at the same time. We can acknowledge that progress has been made while recognizing that deep and perspective inequality remain. We can accept that politics are often designed with good intention, while also understanding that they may still produce exclusive effect. And we must recognize that dimensionally inequality is not about fixing one issue in isolated, but also addressing in multiple dimension nature. Simplicity explanations are not just insufficient, they are actively harmful. They shift attention away from structural causes and place reform representing an individual rather than a system. In doing so, the obstacles are deeper and on the problem and daily maintaining changes. Understanding complexity, therefore, and now an academical example, it is responsibility. Only by recognizing how inequality is produced, maintained, and reinforced can we begin to work required for genuine and lasting transition. As we close this model, it is important to return to the key ideas that run through everything we have explored. First, inequality is multidimensional. It cannot be understood by looking at a simple factor in isolation. Gender, class, disability, age, migration status, and other dimensions of identity operate at the same time within the same system. To truly understand inequality, we must examine how these interaction systems of power work together and shape people's life experience. Second, barriers do not simply add up, they reinforce one another. Discrimination is not a matter of one disadvantage layer on top of another in a simple way. Instead, different barriers interact, interfere, and produce unique forms of marginalization. This is why people at multiple intersections often face challenges that are not visible when we focus on one simple category. Finally, context matters. Inequality does not exist in a vacuum. Place, people, history, and social environments fundamentally shape how inequality operates and how it experiences it. What marginalization looks like in one context may be different from another, even when similar identities are involved. Understanding context helps us avoid oversimplification and recognizing the reality people face in their everyday lives. Taking together this message reminds us that address inequality requires norms, attention, and responsibility. Inequality is not just a concept, it is the way of seeing the world more equally and finding for building more inclusive and inequality system. Intersectionality matters today because the societies we are living in are becoming increasingly complex and diverse. Migration, urbanization, and challenging demographics patterns means that communities are made up of people that with very different identities, experience, and needs. Gender, age, class, discrimination, migrant status, and many other dimensions interact in everyday life. In this context, simple access approach to equality are no longer enough. It are no longer enough to understand social realities. At the same time, inequality itself is challenging. While Overs and explanation discrimination is often less sociable acceptable than in the past. They does not mean that inequality has disappeared. Instead, it has become more structural and in many cases more subtle. Barriers are increasingly endemic in the institution, organization cultures, administrative providers, digital systems, or even algorithms that appear neutral at the surface but reproduce existing powers in invented. This means that discrimination is not always visible or institutional, but it is still impactful, deeply impactful. Politics or practice designed without an perspective may underestimate exclusive those who are already most marginated. Without recognizing how different forms of disadvantages interact, this system risks to reinforce inequality rather than reduce it. For this reason, we need better analytical tools. Intersectionals allow us to move beyond simplicity explanations to see how inequality actually operates in contemporary societies. It helps us identify who is being left behind, whose experiences are being overlooked, and why well intentioned solutions sometimes fail to reach those who need them most. Ultimately, intersectionality matters today because it helps us reveal it, rather the obstacles and social realities. It provides a framework that is capable of capturing complexity and guiding more accurate analysis, more inclusive politics, and more effective actions in the world where inequality is intrinsically interconnected. Intersectionality helps us understand the world as it really is, not as we assume it to be. This is the key idea to keep in mind as we close this topic. Very often, we rely on simple explanation. We tell overlook that inequality is caused by one fact or one decision or one group of people. Intersectionality challenges that way of thinking. It asks us to slow and look more carefully at reality, even when the reality is uncomfortable or complex. This framework invites us to move beyond easy narratives and contemplate assumptions. It reminds us that social life is shaped by many overlapping forces, and that no one experienced the world from a neutral position. Our gender, our background, our education, our place in society all influence what we notice and what we overlook. Intersectionality also encourages us to listen more carefully to marginal voice, now as an act of charity, but in a way to gathering more accurate knowledge. If we only rely on dominant perspective, our understanding of society will always be partial and incomplete. Importantly, understanding intersectionality is not about memorizing the theory or using the right academic language. It is about developing humility and analytical rigor. It is about recognizing the limits of our own experience and being willing to encourage one reality that may be different from our own. In this sense, intersectionality is not just a concept, it is a way of thinking, a way of questioning, and a responsibility. A responsibility to see complexity, to resist oversimplification, and to work through more inclusive and just systems. And finally, thank you for taking the time to encourage with this content. Understanding intersectionality is essential if we want to address inequality in meaningful and effective ways. When we recognize how multiple systems and operations interact, we move beyond surface level solution and start to see what really inclusion requires. This perspective helps us design approaches that are fair and more responsible to people's lived realities, eventually to those whose experiences have often been ignored, simplified, or purchased to the margin. Intersectionality remains that equality is not about treating anyone the same, but about responding to different needs with answers and responding on responsibility. It encourages us to question existing systems, to reflect on our own assumptions, and to remain open to learning. As we move further, I invite you to continue reflection, questioning, and deepen in your understanding. Creating more just and equality systems is not one-time task. It is ongoing process that requires dialogue, commit, and the willing to center those more affected by inequality. Thank you for listening and for being part of this process.